Hello. Looking here at one of my favorite albums ever, Nirvana's In Utero from 1993. This particular copy, so like so many of these that I talk about, I've owned multiple times. The first copy I had was a cassette copy, and it wasn't actually me. Mine was my older brother's, but I think I bought it off him. You know, when you're a kid, you like wheel and deal with your brothers and sisters. Don't know why I bought it off him. Maybe he was a prick and he just wouldn't let me listen to it. But anyway, I remember, yeah, I had it. He got it for Christmas and I had it. And this would have been about 1994. And then I lost that or something. And then I've owned the CD version a few times. At least, this is at least the second, if not the third copy I've had. So I picked this up about 2 years ago for $1. Pretty happy to have this. Um, like I talked about yesterday with the Soundgarden album, as you can see there, it's just from looking at the plastic and the kind of the cloudiness and the scratches on the plastic on the front, that you can see it would have been from around 93, 94, originally purchased. It's not a reissue or anything like that. Got the black edging from that era. You might recognize that disc. It's in okay condition. There's a few scratches, but it plays fine. I just listened to the whole thing through about 2 days ago, and it didn't skip once. So there you go. Now this version here, this is something that I think wasn't on the previous version. So I looked up this before. So this is on the last one. You can see it's got track 13, gallons of rubbing alcohol flow through the strip. That was that's on all of the albums, but as a secret song. It's not track listed. It's the last track usually is just All Apologies at track 12, and it doesn't actually say gallons of rubbing alcohol. It's about however long minutes of silence, and then that would come on. But on this version, it's actually listed on the back as an album track. It says on one of the things, the Discogs thing I read was that that's for non-US pressings, which makes sense. This probably is not a US pressing, as it was bought in New Zealand. Probably an Australian pressing, like most of these are. Um, However, the one that I had in the 90s or later also didn't have that listed as track 13. So I don't know. Anyway, you might see on your own copy, it might be listed as track 13, or it might be as a secret track after All Apologies finishes, a few minutes of silence, and then that one comes on. So this was what? This was their third album after the mega success of Nevermind. It was recorded in early '93. Okay, so it wasn't it wasn't a long period between Nevermind and this. It was released in mid '93, September '93, and they recorded this with Steve Albini. Steve Albini is someone who's produced a lot of great albums. If you go through his the list of albums he's produced, he's a lot of classic albums on there, in my opinion. But he also has a very specific sound. However, yeah, I don't know. I've read and watched interviews with him where he says he doesn't have a sound and he just does exactly what the band asked him to do. That he sees himself more as an engineer than a producer. However, you can't tell me the drum sound that you hear on this, and for example, like Bone Machine on the Pixies song, or on Steve Albini's band stuff like Shellac and things like that. That drum sound is, as soon as you hear it, you know it's Steve Albini track. It's a Steve Albini production. So I haven't listened to everything he's done, and maybe he doesn't always have that drum sound, but I think he does have a sound, but he claims he doesn't. And there's a lot written about that. Um, Either way about that. There's also, well, I'll talk about that later about his opinion about this, but Well, actually, no, we'll talk about it now. So they recorded this quite quickly. I think they did it within like 2 weeks. I was reading that Kurt Cobain tracked all his vocals on the whole album within 6 hours, from first to last. Every vocal track done within 6 hours. I don't know if that's completely true or if that's just part of it. If there was other album tracks done throughout the recording, and regardless, 2 weeks, for a band of that level is a pretty quick album, making of an album done in 2 weeks. Now, you hear bands taking 2 years to do albums, if not longer. So once they'd finished, it was. I've never actually heard. I think that you can hear it around maybe the unmixed version, so like the raw version. So Steve Albini did some mixing with the band. Then they took it, and there's so many conflicting stories and accounts, but they presented it to, I guess, Geffen or their management, and the record company didn't like it. They said it was too raw, and there wasn't any songs, any kind of singles, which in listening to it is ridiculous. Regardless of the mixing, how could you listen to Heart Shaped Box or Dumb or All Apologies or so many of them are just like, it can so easily be presented as singles. It's not as though it's like all like freeform punk jazz jam sessions or anything. Anyway, there was a talk of it like being thrown out completely, starting from scratch, and then they did some mixing and mastering. I think Bob Ludwig did the mastering, and then they got Scott Litt, who I talked about a couple of weeks ago. He's a producer, most notably associated with REM. He did the mixing on Heart Shaped Box, and they had other bits and pieces of mixing done. By the time it was finished, I guess they were satisfied. Steve Albini says that when he heard it, the finished, the album that you buy in the shops, that he thought it was unrecognizable from what he had worked on, and he didn't like the sound at all. I think it sounds great. I think I haven't heard the raw Steve Albini mix to give an opinion on that, but I think it tempers whatever he did with keeping enough of it. You can so hear that kind of that natural reverb that he uses. He talks about, when he talks about production, he talks about using the room and microphone placement, and like I said, especially that drum sound. At the same time, maybe taking off some of the harsher edges with some of the after mixing that they did. So I think it's a great sounding album personally. I love it. And even compared to Nevermind, I love Nevermind as much as I love this album, but Nevermind is very, I talked about this, I used this word the other day, like sheeny, like very glassy production, really compressed. Like, they do that for radio so that they sound good on the radio. And not that I don't like the production on Nevermind, but I think this one sounds more natural, the production on the Utero. I think, yeah, it's so, yeah. There's a lot written. You can read interviews with Kurt Cobain, Chris Novoselic, Steve Albini, and everyone else, and they all give differing stories about how they felt about the album before. This was before it was released, and what they wanted done to it. And there's so many conflicting stories. And at the end of it, I think this is fine. I think Steve Albini sometimes is a bit of a crank and says things just to be a contrarian almost. But I guess, he also has his own, he comes from the punk world, doesn't he? So I guess he has his own feelings about production, the sounds. And I did read quite a funny quote of his. I haven't got it in front of me, but when they were doing the recording, he said he only wanted the band there. And the band said that as well. They didn't want any intrusion from record label or management. And Steve Albini said, he agreed with that, and, instituted the policy that he would have done that anyway. And he said anytime he talked, and after the album or preparing for the album, anytime he talked to anyone involved with Nirvana outside of the band, He said that was some of the biggest pieces of shit he had ever met in his life, like their management and the record company. He said he got on really well with the band. He liked the guys in the band. Courtney Love came up during the partway through the recording process, and apparently she had a bit of a detrimental effect for a few days while she was there. Which, yeah, not going to get into that whole side of things with Courtney Love, but what have we got here? Serve the Servants, brilliant opener. Kind of like it's like a statement of where he is. I feel the lyrics of that song is like after the success they've achieved, and it's kind of like he's kind of just stating how he feels now. Teenage angst has paid off well. Now I'm, what is it, bored and old and bored. Excuse me. Scentless Apprentice, those huge drums, heart-shaped box. That was, when I was a kid, that was my favorite song on this album. Rate Me, that's probably, I think, one of the weakest songs on the album. Francis Farmer Will Have a Revenge, brilliant song. I love the thing that I like about this album is the mixture of the dissonance that he uses. A lot more kind of, the guitar's a lot more free. It's not as kind of pinned down as it is in Nevermind. You know, Nevermind is so tight that this is a lot kind of there's more scope of movement in the guitar, and he's a lot kind of just the use of like distortion and feedback and Dumb, very pretty song. You know, they did that in the Unplugged session as well. Very Ape and Milk It, both kind of like quite raw punk sounding songs. Pennyroyal Tea. So one of the things I like about this, and again about the production, is the way that they slam the guitar in. And they do it really well on Pennyroyal Tea, where it starts off with acoustic with just Kurt singing, and then the drums do, and then the guitar just, it's like he, steps on the pedal. It's just like a wave. The guitar, he's famous for using a lot of chorus, Kurt Cobain, and I don't know, something about the way that it's produced or mixed. I don't know, that I just love the way that sounds. Where there's a few songs where it does that. And the first song, "Serve the Servants," where it starts off, and then it comes in with the kind of the big power chords, and it's just a huge, like I say, like a wave of guitar. When I was a kid, when I first heard this as a 13-year-old, Radio Friendly Unit Shifter was probably a song that I didn't much like. Now it may be my favorite song on the album, although that kind of changes from year to year. But I love the way that song, it kind of starts off, it's got a lot of kind of like distortion feedback again, the guitar just kind of like whining, and then the rhythm section comes in with Chris and Dave Grohl, and they're really tight together, bass and drums, do 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 do, and then the guitar's kind of off wheeling around, with feedback and kind of weird solo, and then it kind of comes all crashing together with this really like tight unit for the main riff. That's like one of my favorite parts on the album. And then the same song, the bridge or the middle eight, whatever you want to call it, the hate your enemies. What is it? Hate your enemies, find your friends, or something like that. No, hate your enemies, save your friends, find your place, speak the truth. That part, the way he sings that, his voice is so raw. And they were saying, Steve Albini said he didn't double track any of the vocal tracks. Like in Nevermind, Butch Vig famously was trying to get Kurt Cobain to double track vocal takes to kind of give a broader vocal sound, I guess. But Steve Albini didn't want to do that. He wanted to use the room, the natural, I guess, reverb or whatever you want to call it of the room, atmosphere of the room to give this voice more power. And in that bridge, just the rawness of his voice, it sounds like he's like tearing his throat apart, getting that part out. All Apologies, I don't know. I'm a bit mixed on that song. To be honest, that's kind of up there with one of those songs where if I didn't hear it again in my life, I probably heard it enough times. Um, because when that came out, that was, I think, kind of the lead single on Unplugged. I think it was All Apologies, or was it About a Girl? But I just remember in that time, just after he died, and then when they released Unplugged, and it seemed that that unplugged version of All Apologies was just everywhere for a good 2 years, just so overplayed. And like I said, finishes off with a kind of jam session, punk jam, gallons of rubbing alcohol flow through the strip. So not a bad song on the album. They're all good. So I said, like, for example, Rape Me and All Apologies. Maybe, I don't really need to hear them as much as I would once have. But as an album, it's just, for me, a 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10 album. No question. Something I'd love to see on this is you might have seen the classic albums documentary series. They've done one on. They did one on Nirvana, Nevermind. They've done one on the Metallica Black album. They did it on a Steely Dan album. I think it was Asia. Paul Simon's Graceland. Deep Purple album. Anyway, it's a really good documentary series. It was made in like the early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s. And they talk to the producer and the whatever surviving members of the band and some other kind of like critics and things, and they go back in the studio and go through some of the takes. A producer or a mixer, if they play the masters, they can kind of fade up and down and show the isolated tracks, things like that. Like, this is the bass, and they can take away all the other instrument tracks and just play the bass. And it's really insightful to see, how an album is made. Like, I think it's on the you can see a video of it on YouTube where Butch Vig's going through Drain You and all the different guitar tracks. Like, they use 4 or 5 different separate guitar tracks using different guitars to get that guitar sound. I would love to see one of those documentaries on this album with Steve Albini. It would probably be a lot less technical, as in there would be a lot less tracks, because that wasn't his recording thing about, overdubs and all the rest of it. But just talking about the sounds and why the sound choice, and again with some of the members like Dave and Chris and whoever else, just talking about the album and how it was made, and that would be a brilliant thing. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but it would be great if they did do that. The album cover art, I think there was a bit of a controversy that they had to cover some stuff up to sell this in Walmart in America, or certain chain stores wouldn't stock it because it showed, well, I don't know, what, nudity, maybe, if you class that as nudity, an anatomical model. Well, I just realized I skipped over Tourette's, didn't I? I didn't talk about Tourette's. When when we were kids, me and my friends, that was, the most hardcore song. You can't even hear the lyrics, man. It's still a cool song, but maybe now the youthful novelty is worn off a little bit. But we got some of the lyrics here, not all the lyrics. Some pictures of the band playing live. That's at Reading, isn't it? We came out in a wheelchair, and everyone thought he wasn't going to show up. It's the band. Again, it's just live shots. He, like, throughout this album, there's kind of references to birth, childbirth. You can see there with, obviously the female model, and here on the back, there's all sorts of like fetuses and baby parts and all sorts of things going on here. Is that some sort of, I don't know, fallopian tube or something? Also, some of the lyrics, you can hear him mention things about birth, afterbirth, my water broke, other bits and pieces. He had just become a father. What year was Francis born? 92, I think. So maybe just before this album was released, I believe. So maybe that affected him. I don't know. there's not much else I can say about it. It was a really important album for me when it came out. I got into Nirvana literally a couple of months before he died. He died in April of 94. And I remember I first started, I'd heard Nirvana in 91, 92, 93, but I was kind of like a little kid. I was like 11, 12 years old then. But when I like started first getting, like kind of really getting into music around 13, the start of 1994, end of 93, start of 94. And yeah, he died literally kind of like a couple of months after that. So this album was really important to me as a kid, as in like played a big part of my life, in my musical development as a listener, not as a player or anything. And still now, what, 25, however many years here, 25 years later, it still stands up, still an absolute classic for me. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Thank you for watching.